can go ahead and get started. It looks like everything is hooked up correctly, and hopefully I've got all the settings set correctly to the public, so you can access this and join me live if you want to. Um, if you want to be critiqued, just a reminder, you need to be on my email list. You can join my email list by going to dablon.com. And there are a couple ways on the website that you can submit your email. I think I have something up at the top that says if you want to be part of the critique, click here and submit your email. And I send out an email every week on Wednesday asking for submissions. Of course, you could submit an image before Wednesday if you would like, and I'll hold on to it for the next one. But that is how you get your image on a critique. And I'm happy to critique anything you throw at me. So I'd love to see what you're up to. Also, generally speaking, or the kind of qualifier there is that I would like you to only submit work that you are either currently working on, works in progress, or that you recently completed, so that we can keep this focused on work that's actually happening right now. I think there's some benefit in terms of the inspiring capacity or inspiring potential of that work if we just focus on work that's happening right now. So I had 2 submissions today, one from Gwen and one, actually a couple different paintings from Anne. So we're going to take a look at those, and let me get myself set up for this real quick. All right. So let's go over to Photoshop. And this is an image that was sent in by Gwen. I've got a couple different versions of it that she sent. She sent in some detail images as well, but I think for the majority of this critique, I'd like to just focus on the overall composition. So there's a couple things going on here that I think are very interesting. There is a sense of like, it looks like you want to be fairly naturalistic in your representation, meaning that there does appear to be some sense of three-dimensional space. I get the sense that there is a light source, and that light source is interacting with three-dimensional objects, as opposed to something that's more stylized or abstracted, right? I don't get this sense. There is a little bit of stylization here, kind of an illustrative quality, where things are kind of simplified. But it does seem like it wants to adhere to kind of a fairly realistic illusionistic space. So if I take that as an assumption that you want this to appear to be kind of more or less a three-dimensional space, there are some things about light logic that I'd like to address. But before I get to that, maybe just looking at the composition as a whole and thinking about how I would read this image. So it is a diptych. It's got 2 different panels or 2 different canvases that comprise the overall composition. That having a diptych, having 2 different compositions, and you have that seam right in the center, once again is going to kind of reinforce or draw our attention to that center line, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it kind of, just by virtue of it being 2 parts, going to separate and create this kind of symmetry in the actual physical being of what it is, like the 2 canvases. So you're going to have that strong tendency already just by virtue of the format to really go strongly in the center. And then you have currently a very anomalous, meaning that something that's kind of its own thing, different than everything else in the scene, anomalous plant, and also a plant that has colors that are kind of complements of the colors that are surrounding it. So there's a very strong focal point that you're putting right on in that center. And sometimes, I tend to discourage that because we want compositions to invite people off that center line and get the the viewer moving around in the composition rather than reinforcing that natural focal point in the center. But in this case, it feels like it's kind of a feature. Like this is kind of a portrait of that plant, and you have enough going on elsewhere in the image that there really is quite a bit of movement that brings us off that center point. And you have some other kind of secondary focal points that are strong enough that can pull us away from that center point as well. So I wanted to talk about a couple of those. I'm going to go to Hue Saturation here and actually just pull down all the saturation information out of the image. So we're just looking at values, just light and dark. And notice how your lightest value are these flowers that aren't the center flowers. And then the most value contrast, light dark contrast you have are over here where it gets to be almost black in the background and then white on these flowers. In the center, these are white, but the surrounding area isn't as dark as it is out towards the edges. So your highest value contrast is kind of out here toward the edges. And your largest shape in the composition are these lighter, largest solid shape. You've got kind of these smaller shapes, and maybe, I guess, the overall shape of the negative space in the background could be considered a shape. But these very large shapes are all the lightest value. So I'm kind of torn a little bit because it feels like, on one hand, it kind of feels like the way that you've organized this plant right here in the center and the way it's kind of different than everything else, and you've got these other plants that are reoccurring and feel more like a context that features this plant. I kind of expect this to be the focal point, but then we have these areas of a high contrast that are kind of vying for our attention and pulling us off that, which is a good thing because it gets us out of the center of the composition, but it is also confusing me a little bit in terms of really establishing what it is that I'm supposed to be paying attention to here. So there's a couple different ways that we can communicate something that is of primary importance, focal point. Part of it is how we arrange it in the overall composition, where the place that we give it, the relative surface area that it covers. So in this case, like a larger shape, a shape that occupies more of the compositional space, that communicates importance or something that is that ought to be grabbing our attention. So having these flowers over here be larger than the flowers in the center, just as shapes, and then more contrasting with the areas around them, starts to kind of make those battle a little bit more for my attention. Saturation, really bright colors also communicate importance, and also specific colors like reds are going to be psychologically more compelling or more attractive. Also, you have this contrast between the oranges, red oranges, and blue in the background, which is a complementary relationship, and so those are really popping out. So there are things here that draw me to this center plant, but then these white plants kind of pull at me too. So I don't know. I kind of want these center plants to be even bolder or maybe bigger, or at least bigger than these white flowers, to make them feel just a little bit more powerful, a little bit more clearly the dominant or the message, the point of this overall image. I do like how you've created the asymmetry across that center axis with these flowers. You have 3 over here, 2 over here. These 3 kind of have a nice swoop energy about them. Looking at the overall composition, there are a lot of nice bits of movement happening. And let me see if I can get a brush here to kind of point some of those things out. So we do have, the way some of these flowers kind of line up, there's this diagonal energy that brings us kind of a strong diagonal happening there. The way these bubbles come up from the bottom and then fan out into this shape, create that kind of that nice energy. You've got these flowers that are all different sizes that create that sense of space. So size variation is one of the nonlinear perspective techniques. So things that are bigger or shapes that are the same shape, the bigger ones look bigger and closer to us. The smaller one tends to be further away. You have overlapping. That also helps create space and stuff like that. I like that you put this horizon line, or the separation between the ocean floor and the negative space in the ocean right there. Looks like it's pretty close to the third, but it's not dividing it right in the center. So compositionally, just the general way that you've organized this, I'm liking a lot of what's happening. I think the one thing that I would say here, though, is that I think my kind of sense is that I want these flowers in the center to be strong, to be strengthened relative, especially to these big white flowers over there. Okay, so that's just composition-wise, the way you're organizing the elements of your composition. Also with bubbles, there is a logic to bubbles. As they rise to the surface, they expand because the pressure on that air that's in the bubble, it lessens. And so the bubbles get bigger. I think that could also be accentuated a little bit. It's happening a little bit, but I think some of these other bubbles, maybe especially toward the top, could get quite a bit bigger to give us that sense of upward movement and the bubbles expanding as they get closer to the surface. And then finally, what I had wanted to point out here is light logic. So light logic is, whenever we're talking about 3D on a 2-dimensional plane, like a canvas, we have to create an illusion of 3D. It's not 3D, it's 2D. It's paint on canvas on a flat surface. So it's all an illusion, and central or key to that illusion is light logic. So we have to represent this scene, this imagery in a way that coincides with our understanding and expectations of how light interacts with 3-dimensional objects in the real world, in space. If we don't establish that light logic, or if we contradict that light logic anywhere in our image, it doesn't take much. If we contradict that light logic, it's going to start feeling, the illusion is going to be broken, and we're not going to believe it quite as much. And it's going to start to feel like it's flattening out. So there are a couple places here where I would recommend that you think about reinforcing light logic a little bit more. One is the overall lighting of the scene. Now, it could be that you have multiple light sources. It could be that you have, big objects or seaweed or animals in the water that are occluding light sources so that you get kind of a patchy light. It could be that you have reflective surfaces that are bouncing light around. And in fact, that's most likely the case, especially underwater, where water itself is fairly reflective and refractive and will move light around in interesting ways. But generally, you got to have consistency and a suggestion of where the light is coming from. So if I look at what you're showing me here, let's look up closely at some of these flowers. We've got highlight, shadow. So we've got this highlight and shadow relationship that's happening that makes me think that the light source is probably coming from in front of these flowers, coming from basically the viewer. So that makes me think maybe this is somebody scuba diving that has a light that's shining on these things, or that there's sunlight coming in that's behind and slightly above. We have some light hitting down here on the ocean floor. We don't have as much of a suggestion of how light is interacting with these white flowers. There is kind of, in this one, a suggestion that maybe there's a bit of a shadow here, but now that I'm close, I don't even really see a strong indication of that. Over here on these on this plant right here, you've got these highlights that are on top, kind of on top of the plant, and then shadow on the underside of these branches. So that would suggest kind of a light source, again, coming from above or slightly above and in front of. But we got to pay really close attention to that light logic that we're implying. The bubbles will also give us some kind of indication. Now you've typically a bubble or any orb, any sphere kind of three-dimensional thing will have a specular highlight. You know, kind of like on my eye, I've got two light sources actually hitting me. So I've actually got on each eye, on each sphere of eyes, I've got two highlights, two specular highlights, two bright points of light that are reflecting completely off the surface of my eye because it's glossy, it's shiny. And that's the same with bubbles. So the bubbles will be a clear indication of where our light source is coming from. And in this case, you're putting these specular highlights on the bubbles at the top right, which makes me think or suggest that the light source is coming from top right. But then you have some highlight also coming around kind of in a stylized way, where they're kind of defining the outer edge of the bubble. So there is a little bit of a contradiction there in the bubbles. And then on some, you've got this highlight that's on the top and some on the side. So generally speaking, we need more of, if you want it to be a believable three-dimensional space, you've got to really pay attention to light logic and make sure that you're not saying over here the light source is coming from this direction and over here a completely different direction. If you're going to do that, then you might be able to sell it as, you know, as if there are multiple light sources and reflections and stuff like that. But generally speaking, even in the ocean, there is going to be a fairly dominant primary directional light source. And again, it kind of depends on the scenario, but you're giving us some indications of that here. Also, remember, not only is the direction of the light important, but the proximity of these objects to the light source. So the closer it is to the light source, the lighter it's going to be. And then as things get further away from the light source, there is pretty significant drop-off of that light. So it's going to get dramatically darker the further it is away from the light source. So this is what I am going to recommend first here. And this can also not just reinforce a sense of three-dimensional space, it can also help reinforce focal point. What I've made here is a simple gradient from white to black, and that's going to kind of approximate this idea of having a light source, and as things get further away from that directional light source, they're going to get darker and darker. And I'm going to apply that to your image with what's called a multiply layer. So this is, I've exaggerated, gone a little bit too far, but you see how that gradient is lighter where it was white on the gradient in the center, and then it gets gradually darker as it goes away from that center point. This is suggesting an overall kind of dominant light source in the center. I'm going to take down the opacity of that so it's not as strong, but it will still be present. So you can see out how, as it gets toward the edges, it's getting darker. And that's, again, giving us a suggestion of light fall off. And that's reinforcing this idea that light is coming from in front of this scene. And then it's a fairly directional, maybe kind of spotlight that's getting darker as it goes further away. Then I think you could go in and you could achieve that with, you know, like a little bit of glazing that that's a kind of a glazed gradient into dark as it gets out toward the edges. You could do that with a kind of a neutral or like ivory black, doing a glaze with ivory black, very subtle glaze. Ivory black is a nice, cool, neutral black. All right, and then the other thing would be to go in here to the plants and start reinforcing that sense of light logic. So I'm going to make a new layer here. And so if I were to take a little bit of the dark color that you've put in the middle of the plant and just take a little bit of that underneath here. That might be too much. And maybe I want to be a little bit more neutral than that so I don't take away from the saturation of that color in the middle. But you see, as I add a little bit more of a shadow there, it's starting to feel more three-dimensional. And if I add a shadow on the bottom side of this plant, I want to make sure that it is consistent on this flower over here. So maybe a little bit more of a darker shadow. And if the light is coming from in front of, then I want to just make sure that it's consistent on all of these flowers, so I don't contradict where I'm telling my viewer the light source is coming from. So as I darken that value on the shadow side of the plant, do you see how those are starting to feel more three-dimensional? I can do the same here with the white flowers. So I'm going to take that white and actually go in here and just go down and not get super dark, but a little bit darker. And I'm not exactly sure what the shape of these white flowers are, but I'm just going to add, it's going to have to be consistent with the shadows on these flowers, right? Because they're all kind of occupying the same space. So if I go in on each of these flowers, and maybe I could get that even a little bit darker, especially for the sake of demonstration here. So putting a little bit more of a shadow on these flowers too, on the bottom and left side. And again, I'm not exactly sure what kind of flowers these are or what they actually look like, if they have any kind of special kind of indentations or whatever. But hopefully you can kind of see how I'm starting to reinforce the same light logic that I've established in these flowers on these flowers over here as well. And then, including all the way over to the side here. And wherever they would be deeper inside the plant, closer to the stem or attaching to the stem, maybe there would be an even darker point where they kind of curve completely away from the light. So that is what is happening on the flowers. Now on the plant, the green part of the plant here, you have some indication of highlight and shadow, but then it's kind of been flattened out and stylized, where you've kind of got this light outline and a suggestion of separations of these vines, but we don't have a clear sense of the roundness, of the volume of those vines. And the same thing has to happen there as happens up here in the flowers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these dark colors down that are on these vines, and then you've got to make a decision. You got to decide. Looks like some of the flowers are closer to us, some are further away, some are behind others. So right here it looks like this vine right here is going behind another one. Actually, I'm going to just grab this dark color back here. So it's going behind this vine right there. So there's going to be a shadow. There's going to be a shadow right here where it is going behind the flower and attaching. Same thing over here. There's going to be a shadow where the flower itself is casting a shadow on the vine because it's blocking the light on all of these, most likely. Looks like this flower in the back is kind of hiding behind these ones in the front. This one right here is in the back. So anytime you have a suggestion of overlapping, you got to make sure that, especially with this kind of light source, that it's making sense with your light logic. And then I'm going to go the opposite direction. I'm going to pull some of this lighter value green and see if I can hit some more of the highlight on those. Let's see, get a more saturated light value green so you can see what I'm doing here. So this isn't necessarily the right kind of green, but I'm going to start just establishing. So this is coming out from underneath the flower and is curving around, probably catching the same light that's hitting right there on the flower. Same thing over here on top of this part of the plant. It's going to be consistent. Again, it's most important that you're just consistent. You got to choose where the light is coming from and then apply that same logic of where the light is coming from as if it were interacting with all of these three-dimensional objects in that space. And then I don't know exactly what's happening here, but there are probably some leaves coming up or something like that. So do you, hopefully that makes sense and you can kind of see what's happening there. But that this plant itself, you're going to push that sense of three dimension, and by applying the same light logic you've applied to these flowers, that a light source is coming from this direction, hitting these three-dimensional objects on this side, and then getting darker as those three-dimensional objects curve away from the light. Finally, here, what I'm going to say is that you could clarify how that light is also hitting the base around this plant. So I'm kind of working quick and messy here, but so if light is kind of hitting this part of the sea floor, if it's coming from this direction, it's going to hit and be lighter in front of the plant, and then the plant is probably going to be casting somewhat of a shadow. And shadows are good ways to suggest a relationship between this foreground element and the background. So it might be casting a shadow, but then generally this, let's see, this whole area that is facing the light is going to be hit with the same strength of light that's hitting the flowers, right? And what that's also going to do, so it's reinforcing the sense of a directional light hitting this plant casting a shadow on the ground getting hit by the same light, the greenery getting hit by the same light, all the different flowers, and then you'd want to go through in every single plant, make sure that it is consistent with the rest of the light logic you're establishing everywhere else. And I think having a really clear light source is going to make it less confusing to the viewer on how to understand that space. And it is also just, in that clarity will strengthen the image itself and make it more believable and stand out more and less, and invite the viewer in and help us occupy that space a little bit more believably. Last thing I'll do here is there's just with these bubbles, so I would just make sure that the bubbles have the same light logic, that you're not contradicting them. So maybe a little bit more of a shadow side there. This highlight, there might be some reflected light there on the bottom side of the bubble, but I would just make sure you don't get that little reflected light at the bottom doesn't get to be as light as your, let's see, let me get a little bit lighter there, but that it doesn't get as light as the specular highlight up here. If that makes sense. Let's see, I'm going to get rid of some of that outer edge there. And we're getting a little bit of that, this gradient that I put on there, so you can't see it quite. I want that to be a little bit lighter. Maybe I'll put that on that layer right here. Bump those up. That is not popping like I would like it to. And what? Oh, I see. There we go. Okay, so that little specular highlight would be coming from the direction of your light source. So there might be a little bit of reflected light around here, around the circumference, but it shouldn't get as light as that specular highlight. And that specular highlight is a direct reflection of where the primary light source. All right, so I kind of spent a lot of time on that, but I think for me that's where this image is kind of falling apart for me a little bit, is those areas that are contradicting in terms of light logic. There's there can be a nice, when you play around and kind of distort or mess with light logic, it can be an interesting kind of tension where things start to kind of fall apart into two dimension and kind of play with that illusion, and where it starts to break apart. In this case, I did not see a clear indication that was the intention, that you wanted to mess with our sense of three dimension. Instead, I was looking at it and it felt like you wanted me to engage with this as a more naturalistically lit or three-dimensional space. And in order to get there, yeah, you definitely just focus on being very clear in your own mind as you make this painting where the light source is, what that means about how it would interact with the various parts of this underwater scene and the context of the underwater scene. Okay, so that's actually all I'm going to. I've given it 30 minutes. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm going to move on to Anne. First, for a second, I'm just going to check in on the Facebook stream, and it looks like we've got some of you all here. So I think we're in good shape. And we've got Irv here, Irvin Kovacs. Am I saying Kovacs right? I'm all of a sudden not confident that I'm saying that right. But Irv, good to see your name pop up. And it's been way too long. Man, I miss my emeritus friends. Okay, so going back, and Irv, send me some work. I'd love to get you in on this. On these critiques, and I'd love to see what you're up to. Okay, so now we're going to go take a look at Anne. Anne sent me some pictures of wolves and dogs, and with Anne, and you know, I don't think I probably took as much time as I ought to have. Gwen, the painting's really cool. I love that underwater scene. I like that really extreme wide format, that kind of extreme landscape view. I'd be curious to hear where this is going to hang, and kind of the context for the artwork. I imagine, I don't know. I would just be curious to hear what you're going to do with it. I really like the image. Nice colors, and there's a nice stylized feel about it. So. I don't mean to be entirely critical. There are many, many nice things about it. So, well done. Okay, let's take a look at Anne's. Now with Anne, I'm going to go ahead and close up some of Gwen's so I can quickly go through Anne's images. Okay, so we've got this image, and this image. We've got three different paintings here. This one, and this one. So first off the bat, I'm noticing, especially in this one and in this one, that the background area, the darkest darks, and in fact, let me go and pull out all the color information so we can see this. The darkest darks do not go to black. In fact, if we pull up the levels here, you can see one of these days I'm going to explain what these histograms are. They're actually very useful in Photoshop, but essentially it's a bar graph telling us where are all the different values are on the spectrum of black to white. And you can see down here at the black end of that spectrum, there's almost no information, right? So nothing gets to be completely black. If I pull this up, you can see those, and now I'm telling the computer to make what used to be this shade of gray, make that the new black, and it's going to make and adjust everything in between. But you can see how that gets to be a lot more contrast. So I'm going to Command Z out of that. This could be just a product of the surface, and I've talked about this at length previously, that some oil mediums, and I believe these are oil paintings, some oil mediums dry more matte. Liquid dries more matte. And when a surface is matte, it scatters light more diffusely. So we don't, these areas in the background that probably were painted even with a completely black paint, they appear to be a little bit of a lighter gray just because of the way the surface is reflecting light and kind of diffusing light. If it were a shinier surface, those dark areas would be darker visually. In our perception, they'd be darker because the light would be either reflecting completely or reflecting not at all, which is what glossy surfaces do. And we just get more pop. We'd get more contrast between the lights and the darks. So I would suggest, if you're getting a really matte surface with oil painting, either start using a medium where you could even mix in a little bit of stand oil with your liquid, if you like liquid. Or you can do a 3-part medium where you do English distilled turpentine, stand oil, and Damar varnish. That would be very shiny. And there are other artist mediums that you can use. Or after you're done with your painting using liquid as your medium, you can do a Damar varnish coat at the end, and that's going to make all these dark values really pop, and you're going to get all that contrast. So right now, and it could just be also the photograph, but that is kind of a telltale sign of a matte surface. And one of the challenges of having matte surfaces is you don't tend to get as much of that value contrast just because of the way the light bounces off the surface. That's also one of the problems you have with acrylic paint, which tends to be a little bit more matte just when it comes straight out of the tube. And it looks a little bit more plasticky because of that, because of the way it diffuses light. All right, so, and if I scroll through this one, same problem. So in the background, it looks like it should be darker, and you do get to almost black in the nose and the eyes and the ears, but even in some of the fur areas where I feel like it wants to be darker, it just doesn't get there. In this one, you definitely have those dark blacks. All right, so that's kind of probably just more of a logistical kind of practical painting issue than anything else. If I were to bump up or darken the black areas, you can see how that starts to just pop a little bit more and feel more three-dimensional. You just get more contrast between the lights and the darks, and I'll pull down and make the lights a little bit lighter. And let me just go back and forth. So this is before, after, before, after. You can see how everything just kind of punches a little bit. There's just more contrast. All right, so that does not have much to do with other things. Let me do that here just so you can see it. I'm going to pull in that left side a little bit. So again, we just punch those dark areas a little bit more. This might just be fixed by doing a coat of Damar varnish, and that could completely solve the problem and get you all that, get you that contrast back. And it might look great when the paint is wet, but then when it dries matte, you lose the contrast. It's a fairly common problem, or not problem, but just issue that you run with oil paint. Okay, so there are a couple things that I wanted to say with regard to this one and this one. There's one thing in particular that I wanted to narrow in on, and that is in both of these, this one and this one, this one, and this one, are the backgrounds. So the dogs, coyotes and wolves, are painted. They're very lovely. They look proportionate. They look, realistic. The light logic is fairly good. There are some, just like I was talking about with Gwen, there are some little areas where I would, where it starts to fall apart a little bit for me, and that has to probably do right here, this little strip of light fur, and then on the back, these light spots back here. And it's not that I don't think that the dog might have little patches of light fur. It's that I think they might be getting a little bit too light and in a way not starting to contradict light logic. So even if that's lighter fur, if it's not getting hit directly by light, then it's going to be darker. For example, okay, let me go into this right now since my mind's wanting to go there. So you've got a light source that's coming from above and in front of these dogs. So if I can kind of draw an arrow that approximates that light source, I'm going to try to make it a little bit three-dimensional here. I had a teacher who used to do this that was so much better at it than I am. Let me see if I can fix that cone. No, that's still a bad cone. Anyway, so the light source is coming in from in front of and above these dogs. And that this fur on the front is a convincing white fur, right? So here on the back of the dog, even if that is the same white fur that is up here, if it's further away from the light, it's not going to be as light as this fur, right? It's going to appear darker because it's not because it's a different color fur, but because it's not being hit by the same amount of light. And in fact, on this dog, you can kind of see the pup here, the white fur on his throat right there is darker, probably because the big dog here is occluding or getting in the way of that light source a little bit, so it's a little bit darker, whereas over here maybe he's picking up more of the light on his ear. But see, that fur is getting a little bit darker, but then you've got this light fur right here, you know, that just feels like it should be a touch darker, and it just kind of pops out and starts to mess with my sense of light logic. Okay, so I'm going to undo those little spots of white. And can you kind of see how I should have done that on a different layer? So if I'm going to do that again real quick on a different layer, so you can do a before and after. So just getting rid of, kind of knocking back these white spots right there. And if I turn that off, back on, off, back on, I mean, just those little white dots contradict my sense of light hitting the dog primarily here and then getting darker as it gets toward his back. All right, enough of that. So a little points of light logic. I would, I think on all three, I could go through and be somewhat nitpicky on really narrowing in on that light logic and being consistent with that, so it doesn't kind of grab our attention in a bad way. But what I wanted to focus on in these two images are the background. So all of this, all three paintings, I think, are lovely in the paint application. It looks like you're using enough paint, which sometimes isn't the case. Sometimes we tend to scrimp a little bit, but it looks just the way that the different colors are blending, and there's kind of a softness in some areas that communicates to me that you're using enough paint for it to mix and there's fluidity there. It doesn't feel like it's, you know, a dry brush being scraped across the canvas, and they're mixing in really excellent ways. That's one of the, you know, advantages of working with oil as well. So paint application is fantastic. The representation is nice. The colors are nice. The general organization of your subjects are nice. What I want to focus on in these two is the negative space. So the space, again, behind your subject matter. You have these really nice, just looks like some kind of plant with leaves and stalks. Pretty standard kind of plant. Let me see. Why aren't you? Oh, because it's not visible. All right, so we have these plants in the background. We have and leaves on the plants. What I wanted to point out here is that we basically is the sameness of this background area. There's a very consistent pattern of vertical lines here in the stock. So we have kind of these branches that are kind of a consistent width. And then we have the spaces between the branches or these verticals that are, I mean, there's a little bit of variation, but they're almost too consistent. So do you see how these vertical lines of these plants in the background, they're all fairly evenly wide and then evenly distanced from each other? That might be the case. It might be the example that comes to mind is like when you go driving in a place in a forest where it's been planted by somebody and didn't occur naturally. There's kind of an evenness to the trees and evenness to the size of the trees. And it kind of looks unnatural the way that all the trees are growing kind of in a very same. It looks like it just doesn't look like it would happen without some kind of intervention. That's kind of what it starts to feel like here, and that could be the case. It could be that these wolves are in a place where the plant is remarkably consistent. But I think you would benefit from having more variety there. And my suspicion is that you are getting into kind of a default behavior where you're kind of, this is kind of what the plant generally looks like, and I'm just going to kind of put some plants back there. And this is something that I think we all do to a certain degree. I would just caution you to not just go on autopilot and treat these consistently. So what I'd like to see, and I think it would be more visually interesting, is if there was more variety in the spacing. So there was more kind of blue sky showing through in some areas. Even the shapes of the blue sky all kind of are similar, where there's some gaps in the trees that are wider than others. Those you wouldn't even necessarily have to be accurate in representing your image or whatever you're working from, but maybe strategically placing those gaps so that they help frame your subject matter. These coyotes, I think, in the center. But there is a sameness. There is a consistency to the value, to the shape of the leaves, kind of the size of the leaves. And there's this kind of leaf shape and the direction those leaves are heading. I don't know. There's kind of too much consistency there. It doesn't feel like that would naturally occur, especially in a wild, environment where these dogs might be. So I just like to see a little bit more variety there. I think you could also probably use, with a little creative license, use this negative space to reinforce your focal point. So allow the leaves around the edges of your composition to get a little less saturated and a little bit darker value to help them push back away. And then the leaves that are closer to your focal point's head, let those get to be more saturated greens and maybe even lighter value to reinforce the light logic you have on this foreground dog, and also just to grab our attention in those areas. Something I think I've referred to before, a lot of Northern Renaissance painters would put just a little touch of saturated red in the tear duct or a little bit of saturated color in the eye of a portrait subject, and that little bit of saturation really does a lot to help just, add a little bit of zing to the focal point. Anyway, that could be done here as well. Maybe a tiny bit of saturated red here in the mouth, kind of where his tongue is, and then having that saturated red next to saturated green, that complementary color contrast would help reinforce this this center area or the focal point. Also, maybe in the mouths of the other two, a little bit of saturated color might help kind of draw our attention around to the different mouths. The fact that they have their mouths open, they're howling, that seems like a kind of part of the message here, and something that you might want to reinforce with a little bit of extra, something to grab our attention there. High contrast between the teeth and the dark outlining of the mouth, and then maybe just a little bit of saturated color. All right, so that's that. And then I'm going to say the same thing here. So there is look at the width of this tree and then the width of the spacing between those trees, and then the width of the spacing between these trees, and then the width of the spacing between those trees. The width of this big tree is a little bit wider than the rest, but the other three are all pretty much the same, same basic width. They are spaced. I mean, there's even spacing between these trees on the left, and then these two are overlapping, which is a little bit of variety. But again, I would caution you to be careful not. We tend to want to just take even our reference image and evenly space things out. We have a strong impulse to kind of evenly distribute visual information. I think that it kind of ties into something evolutionary about human beings, but we've got to resist that impulse to want to even everything out. So the branches too, look at the spacing between the branches. They're all kind of consistent. The thickness of the branches across the whole image. There's the thickness right there of these branches. These branches, I don't see any really thick branches that go from thick to thin like I would expect to see on big trees like this. So all the branches are a similar thickness. They're all going kind of, you can see how this branch up here is almost the same branch in terms of direction and shape as that one. I would just like to see a little bit more variety, and my suspicion is that you're just kind of falling into that natural tendency we have to want to make everything kind of evenly distributed. In a wild setting, in a forest, nature doesn't really work that way. Nature doesn't tend to evenly distribute things, especially with things like branches and trees like that. There's lots of knots and variation in the width and size of trees, old trees, young trees, and the branches tend to be thicker at the bottom. They get, kind of thinner up at the top, and they branch in different ways and overlap, and there's just a lot more variety, and I feel like I'm missing a little bit of that there. And that's also potential for us to, again, use the negative space to reinforce what's happening in, the subject matter of your image. The last thing that I'm going to say here, there are some little light logic things that I could go into here, but I think I'll avoid that for now. Well, I'm going to say one thing though. So in this scene where we've got 4 different dogs, my suspicion is that these dogs didn't actually occupy that same space. And there's some indication here of that being the case, just in terms of how the dogs are sitting next to each other and where they would be sitting on the ground, and the ground that's suggested here in the foreground. But really, it's the lighting that kind of tips me off. The lighting on this dog in the foreground, you can see the specular highlight on top of his nose. You can see that the fur on the right side is kind of the same brightness as the fur on the left side. And the ears, there's a shadow on this part on the under of the top of the ear, and then the highlight is down at the bottom of the ear, where it kind of curves out to on top of his head. So the light source is probably coming from straight above, evenly hitting both sides of the face, kind of right down the center, top of his nose. Whereas over here on this dog, the highlight's right there, and then the shadow side of the body is right there. Well, if the light that's hitting this dog is going to be hitting this dog too, the light would probably be hitting this side of his face, top of his head right here, the whole side of his body right here, right? I can almost believe that same light source is hitting this dog, but there's a highlight right here, but not right here where I'd expect there a highlight to be on this dog. So the reason I personally am so in tune with light logic is because I, over the course of my my art practice, I have done a lot of work trying to combine multiple images from different photo references, and it's very challenging when you start to combine. If, like in this case, if you had 4 pictures of 4 different dogs and you're trying to put them in the same picture together, each of those 4 pictures are going to have slightly different lighting scenarios with slightly different points of view from the camera and relationship like to ambient light or directional light. And so it doesn't quite, it's really hard to get those different things to match up. So my eyes especially sensitive to those things, and I kind of get caught up on that. All right. So the last thing that I'm going to say about this image is that I would be wary of, and this is just a red light for teacher Trent. Be wary of, or be careful of, putting your subject matter in contact with the edge of your composition. So in this case, this paw sits right there on the bottom of the image. This back foot kind of rests right at the bottom of the edge, right on that border. So you don't typically want to have a shape of, or one of your primary subject come into contact with a border at a tangent. So imagine, like, for example, if I were to crop this image, this might be a clearer example of this. If I were to take this in and put this right edge of the painting such that the nose of this dog touches that edge of the painting. So coming into contact at a tangent, at a single point with the edge of your painting. Because that creates a tension. That creates, we can't tell if the dog has his nose right up against the edge of the painting, or if we're looking at a window into a much larger scene. It draws, it creates attention and draws viewers' attention to the edges of our composition, and it's kind of distracting in a way. So I think that would be the only thing I would probably either choose to crop more of this foreground dog, or give him more space so that his paws don't sit right there on the edge of the canvas. Obviously, that's not going to happen at this point because the painting is done. But with all of these, Anne, and I didn't get to talk about this one. This one, I think, just generally speaking, is a simpler composition. You don't have as many elements in there. You don't have, and because of that, you're not going to have the same issues with light logic. I really like how in this one, you've got these kind of the light green right here, and then this darker green area. You've divided that up into three, kind of a small, medium, large, or small, medium, large, or something like that. Shapes in the background in the negative space, and there's a nice diagonal that's more active and kind of counterpoint to this diagonal of the way his body is positioned. So I think this is lovely, much simpler composition, and just really well painted. I like it. All of them, well done. And obviously you have, a good command over just the craft of painting. Paint application is great. Colors are great. And modeling is great. So well done. I have been talking for an hour, and that is more of me than perhaps any reasonable person would want on Christmas Eve. So happy holidays to you all. I hope the season is treating you well. I hope everybody's healthy and happy. And if you want to be involved in future critiques, I hope you will be. I hope you submit your images. I've really been enjoying doing this and hope that it's been helpful to you all. And leave me some comments. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I tend to be dwelling too much on one thing or another. I've said this before, but not having an audience here with me makes it more difficult for me to judge if I still have your attention or if you're completely off and don't care anymore. If people are in the room, I can tell when people start to shift a little bit or start to look away, or there are indications that tell me if I ought to wrap it up or not. So the only way I'm going to get that feedback in this environment is if you leave me comments and let me know what you think, what's working, what's not working. So I appreciate you. Glad you're there, and send me images. I love seeing what you're up to, and love being able to see old friends pop up and see your names again. And with that, I will say we'll see you next week. Next week, Thursday, get me your images as soon as possible. And happy holidays to you. Stay healthy. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.